In 2013, the average human attention span was recorded at roughly 12 seconds. It was a metric that had held relatively steady for decades, a baseline for how long a person could focus on a single piece of new information before their mind began to wander. By 2023, independent psychological studies suggested that this number had collapsed to just 8 seconds. To put that into a humiliating biological perspective, that is 1 second less than the estimated attention span of a goldfish. But unlike the goldfish, whose cognitive limitations are a product of evolutionary biology, this decline in human processing power is not natural. It is an induced state, a mass sociogenic illness that has infected an entire demographic. We are witnessing the first generation in history to undergo a radical, unchecked neurological experiment, and the results are manifesting as a collective cognitive fracture known colloquially as tick-tock brain. This is not simply a pejorative term used by older generations to mock the habits of the youth. It is becoming a recognizable cluster of symptoms that mirror early-onset cognitive decline. The mechanism is deceptively simple but devastatingly effective. When a user opens a short-form video app, they are not merely looking for entertainment. They are engaging in a rapid-fire neurological loop known as a variable ratio reinforcement schedule. It is the exact same psychological mechanic used in slot machines to induce addiction. With every swipe of the thumb, the brain anticipates a reward, a laugh, a shock, a visually stimulating image. Most of the time, the content is mediocre, but occasionally it is excellent. That unpredictability causes the brain to release a spike of dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and motivation. However, the problem is not the dopamine itself. It is the speed of the cycle. In the real world, dopamine is usually the reward for effort, finishing a task, solving a problem, or engaging in a meaningful conversation. On the platform, the effort is zero and the reward is instantaneous. This rewires the neural pathways of Gen Z to expect immediate gratification for minimal exertion. The brain, being an organ designed for efficiency, begins to prune away the neural connections required for patience, deep focus, and delayed gratification because they are no longer being used. The result is a physiological inability to tolerate boredom. If you observe a member of Gen Z in a moment of stillness, waiting for a bus, sitting in a classroom, or even during a lull in conversation, you will often see a physical manifestation of anxiety. The hand instinctively reaches for the pocket. This is not a conscious choice. It is a reflex. The brain is screaming for a dopamine hit to regulate its baseline chemical state. When the device is absent, the withdrawal symptoms set in: irritability, brain fog, and a sensation of time dragging painfully slowly. This state of constant hyperstimulation has rendered the default mode network, the part of the brain responsible for daydreaming, self-reflection, and long-term planning, almost entirely dormant. The consequences of this rewiring are bleeding out into the physical economy and the education system with alarming speed. University professors are reporting a phenomenon that was virtually non-existent 15 years ago: students who physically cannot read a 10-page chapter of a book. It is not that they are illiterate. They can decode the words perfectly fine. The issue is that their brains literally cannot sustain the linear focus required to follow an argument from page 1 to page 10 without the intervention of a stimulus break. They find themselves rereading the same paragraph 5 times, unable to absorb the meaning because their mind is frantically scanning for a cut, a sound effect, or a visual transition that never comes. This popcorn brain effect means that complex information, the kind that requires nuance, context, and time to digest, is being filtered out of the generational consciousness. History, economics, and philosophy are complex disciplines. They cannot be explained in 60 seconds, and they certainly cannot be understood while Subway Surfers gameplay footage runs underneath the text to keep the visual cortex occupied. Consequently, we are seeing a flattening of reality. To a brain conditioned by the algorithm, a video about a genocide in a foreign country carries the exact same emotional weight as a video of a cat falling off a sofa, provided they both use the same trending audio. The separation between tragedy and comedy, between truth and performance, has dissolved. The intellect is being replaced by the vibe. When deep analysis becomes neurologically painful, intuition and aesthetic preference take over. Decisions are no longer made based on logic or data, but on how information feels in the first 3 seconds of exposure. This creates a terrifying vulnerability to manipulation. If a concept takes longer than 8 seconds to explain, it is effectively invisible to this demographic. Truth has become a casualty of pacing. If the truth is boring, slow, or nuanced, it is scrolled past. If a lie is fast, loud, and visually arresting, it is absorbed as fact. We are seeing the death of the deep work state, the psychological zone where human beings produce their most profound artistic and scientific breakthroughs. That zone requires 20 to 30 minutes of uninterrupted focus just to enter. For a brain that has been trained to reset its attention clock every 15 seconds, deep work is biologically impossible. The tragic irony is that Gen Z is perhaps the most information-rich generation in human history, having access to the sum of all human knowledge in their pockets. Yet, because their neural hardware has been compromised by the delivery mechanism of that information, they are losing the ability to synthesize it into wisdom. They are drowning in data yet starving for context. The most disturbing aspect of this medical reality is that the subjects of this experiment are often aware of their condition. They joke about their fried dopamine receptors on the very apps that are frying them. This is not a failure of willpower. This is a mismatch between a Paleolithic brain and a godlike technology designed to exploit every evolutionary vulnerability we possess. That exploitation was not an accident. It was an architectural blueprint drafted in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley and Beijing, executed with the precision of a military operation. To understand the severity of TikTok brain, we must stop viewing social media platforms as neutral communication tools and start seeing them for what they truly are: extraction machines. Just as the oil industry extracts carbon from the earth to fuel the physical economy, the attention economy extracts focus from the human mind to fuel the digital one. The difference is that while oil is a finite resource, human attention was assumed to be renewable. But the data now suggests we have reached peak attention, and the drilling has become so aggressive that it is causing the cognitive equivalent of environmental collapse. The engineers who built these systems did not set out to make a generation smarter, happier, or more connected. Their sole metric of success was time on device. However, as the market saturated, the tactics required to keep users engaged had to become more invasive. This triggered what tech ethicists call the race to the bottom of the brainstem. Instead, you must bypass logic entirely and tap into the reptilian brain, the primal center responsible for fear, lust, anger, and automatic reflex. This is why the interface of short-form video apps looks the way it does. It is a masterpiece of hostile design. Notice that there are no stopping cues. In the physical world, a book has chapters, a movie has credits, and a magazine has a back cover. These are natural stopping points that prompt the brain to ask, do I want to continue? The infinite scroll removes these cues entirely. There is no bottom. There is no end. The act of scrolling becomes a subconscious loop, a friction-free slide into oblivion. The interface is stripped of clocks or battery indicators in full-screen mode, creating a casino effect where the user loses all sense of time passing. Behind the screen, the algorithm is operating as a supercomputer playing chess against a novice. It collects thousands of data points every minute: how long you hovered over a video, what you liked, what you shared, and even the micro-hesitations in your scrolling speed. It uses this data to build a digital voodoo doll of your psyche. It knows what makes you angry, what makes you insecure, and exactly what kind of content will keep you staring for another 20 minutes. It is an asymmetric warfare where the individual stands no chance against an artificial intelligence that knows their psychological triggers better than they know themselves. The economic model driving this system is ruthless. In the digital ecosystem, the user is not the customer. The user is the product being sold to advertisers. Therefore, a user with a long attention span, who reads books or engages in hobbies offline, is economically worthless to the platform. A user who is addicted, anxious, and constantly checking their feed, however, is a goldmine. The fragmentation of the human mind is simply more profitable than its coherence. This profit motive has forced a mutation in the content itself. We are witnessing the rise of retention editing, a hyperactive style of video production designed solely to prevent the user from scrolling away. Silence is cut out. Pacing is accelerated to unnatural speeds. Subtitles flash rapidly to keep the eye moving. Loud noises and visual changes occur every 2 seconds. Content creators, who are essentially the gig workers of this digital factory, are forced to adopt these techniques to survive. If they try to make slow, thoughtful, or nuanced content, the algorithm punishes them by burying their work. Thus, the entire cultural landscape shifts toward the loud, the fast, and the shallow. We are training a generation of creators to produce digital sugar, and a generation of consumers to reject anything that tastes like a vegetable. Furthermore, we cannot ignore the specific geopolitical dimension of the TikTok phenomenon. While Western platforms like Instagram and YouTube have eagerly copied the short-form model to compete, the origin of this specific viral architecture lies with ByteDance. There is a marked difference in how the domestic version of the app Douyin is managed in China versus how TikTok operates globally. In its home market, there are strict limitations on usage time for minors, and the algorithm promotes educational and patriotic content, science experiments, museum exhibits, and achievements. The international version, however, has no such guardrails. It feeds the West a diet of pranks, lip syncs, and divisive social commentary. Whether this is an intentional strategy of cognitive warfare or simply the result of unbridled capitalism is up for debate. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that Gen Z is using this digital anesthesia to escape a physical reality that feels increasingly hostile. It is difficult to blame a 20-year-old for retreating into a dopamine loop when the real world offers them stagnant wages, a broken housing market, and a climate crisis. The phone becomes a portal to a world where they have control, where they can be entertained, and where the dopamine is free. The system exploits their economic despair. It offers them a cheap, readily available substitute for the actual milestones of adulthood that have been priced out of their reach. Why save for a house you can never afford when you can get a momentary hit of serotonin right now? Institutions that should be the defense against this intrusion, schools, governments, and families, have been completely outmaneuvered. The education system is still operating on a 19th century industrial model, trying to force students to sit in rows and listen to lectures, while the students' brains have been rewired for a 21st century digital chaotic flow. Teachers are fighting a losing battle, competing against a trillion-dollar algorithmic entertainment complex for the headspace of a teenager. Bans on smartphones in schools are a band-aid on a gaping wound. They address the presence of the device, but not the withdrawal symptoms and the underlying neurological changes that persist even when the phone is locked away in a pouch. The system has successfully colonized the one place that was supposed to be sovereign, the human mind itself. The trajectory we are currently on suggests a stark bifurcation of the human species, not based on race, gender, or geography, but on the ability to command one's own attention. We are moving toward a cognitive caste system. At the top will be the attention aristocracy. Below them will be the distracted masses, a permanent underclass of cognitive laborers whose brains have been so thoroughly fragmented that they are capable only of reactive, low-level processing. This divide is already visible in the private schools of Silicon Valley. The very executives who design these addictive loops for the public send their own children to Waldorf schools where smartphones are banned and learning is tactile, slow, and human-centric. They know what they are selling. They are the drug dealers who do not sample their own supply. They understand that in the economy of the future, the ability to focus will be the ultimate competitive advantage. As artificial intelligence automates routine cognitive tasks, summarizing emails, writing basic code, generating generic art, the value of average intelligence will drop to zero. The only human skill that will remain scarce and valuable is the ability to do what AI cannot: deep, idiosyncratic, long-form creative thinking. For Gen Z, the path forward is not a simple matter of digital detox. But this is not a toxin. It is a rewiring. The damage done to the dopaminergic pathways is structural. Reversing it requires a regimen of neuroplastic rehabilitation that is as painful and demanding as physical therapy after a stroke. The brain, fortunately, is plastic. It can change, but it will fight the process every step of the way. The cure for TikTok brain is the very thing the generation has been trained to fear most: boredom. Boredom is not a defect. It is a physiological necessity. It is the gym where the attention span is built. The treatment, therefore, is to sit in a room alone without a device and endure the agonizing itch of understimulation until the brain stops screaming. It is about reclaiming the spaces in between life's events, the bus ride, the queue, the toilet break, and refusing to fill them with digital noise. However, we must be realistic about the scale of this challenge. We cannot expect regulation to save us. Governments move too slowly and the tech lobbies are too powerful. The algorithm is not going to become ethical overnight. The infinite scroll will not be outlawed. The responsibility for cognitive defense falls entirely on the individual. This is a grim realization, but it is also an empowering one. It frames the act of reading a book not as a leisure activity, but as an act of rebellion. To sit for 2 hours and focus on a single narrative is to spit in the face of an economy designed to turn you into a swipe-happy zombie. The future for Gen Z, therefore, depends on a countercultural movement that values digital asceticism. We may see the rise of subcultures that fetishize slowness and disconnection, in the same way the current culture fetishizes speed and access. We might see dumb phones becoming status symbols. We might see the resurgence of physical media, vinyl, film, paper, books, not just for nostalgia, but as a necessary anchor to physical reality. But there is a darker alternative. We face the prospect of a post-literate society. In this scenario, Gen Z and Gen Alpha become the prompt generation, operators who can feed queries into an AI but lack the fundamental knowledge to verify the output. They become stewards of a knowledge base they no longer understand, reliant on the machine to do the thinking, just as we rely on the calculator to do the math. The danger here is not just economic. It is political. A population with an 8-second attention span cannot understand the nuances of a treaty, a budget, or a constitutional crisis. They can only understand slogans, memes, and emotional triggers. Such a population is ripe for authoritarianism, easily swayed by the loudest, fastest, and most visually stimulating propaganda. The ultimate tragedy of the TikTok brain medical condition is that it robs the youth of their own biography. A life is composed of moments of presence. If you are physically in a room but your mind is in the digital cloud, you are not living your life. You are haunting it. You become a ghost in your own timeline. The thousands of hours spent scrolling are not memories. They are a void. When you look back at a year spent on the algorithm, there is nothing there. No skills learned, no relationships deepened, no insights gained. Just a blur of colored lights and recycled audio. The antidote is a return to friction. We must reintroduce difficulty into our lives. We must choose the movie that is hard to follow, the book that uses difficult words, the hobby that requires months of practice before it becomes fun. We must reject the frictionless, seamless slide of the digital interface and embrace the jagged, slow, resisting texture of reality. We must choose the movie that is hard to follow, the book that uses difficult words, the hobby that requires months of practice before it becomes fun. The battle for the mind is the defining conflict of the 21st century. It is a silent war fought in the private quiet of the skull, with no explosions and no casualties that can be counted in a morgue. But the stakes are total. The winner gets the future. The loser gets the feed. Embrace reality.